Welcome everyone to our second show from COP28 here in Dubai. Today we focus on financing and climate justice, how to get the necessary amounts of money to those who need it most before it's too late, if it's not too late already. We've had some pretty impressive pledges here to support climate action. Pledges, of course, don't mean money on the table now. And we've got the perfect guest, I think, to start this show. Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank. Bill, great to see you again.
Nice to be here.
I know the financing piece is something close to your heart. It's something critical to your business, given how many of your clients in emerging markets are right in the firing line here.
Yeah.
Are we going to see any progress, in your opinion, from this COP?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, it's not too late. We can definitely still, but it's getting harder, right? The more we wait, obviously, the harder it gets, and we have been waiting. Look, I think we've seen some great progress already. I think things like this $30 billion fund set up by the Emirates themselves as a form of alternative blended finance. So it's alternative catalytic capital that can bring big chunks of private sector capital along. And we can all bemoan the fact that this hasn't come from the World Bank or the African Development Bank. We know that they're working on that as well. In fact, I'm sitting in a lab, a World Bank lab, with a handful of other financiers, Ajay Banga, Mark Carney, Sri Devdera, with the mission to come up with structures that can significantly catalyze private sector capital using public sector money. So the more of that we can get in place, the more effective it's going to be, especially in developing economies.
I mean, you and I talked about this in Glasgow a couple of years ago. We heard Mark's announcement then. The money was there. It was about really making that money work. Is the money working now?
Yeah, look, I give you an example. We made a commitment as a bank, Standard Chartered, to mobilize $300 billion of capital over a 10-year period. We have no doubt that we're going to hit that. We're at about 70 billion so far, and we're just getting started. We separately sought to increase our own balance sheet, so the capital that we put into this business, both taking deposits, the sustainable deposits, but also sustainable loans, booming. We told the world that we were going to try to earn an income of $1 billion in sustainable finance. We'll do $700 million this year. Yep. We'll hit the billion next year. So, I mean, the business is booming. There's a ton going on. It's just not enough.
Okay. I want to talk about adaptation. I did a breakfast for you guys this morning. It was about adaptation. And one of the stats that really jumped out, I think it was like 54% of your clients, out of the 59 are coastal countries, coastal cities. So it's really in your interest, in Standard Chartered's interest, that these aren't underwater 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Yeah, and it's not just obviously underwater, it's also subject to horrific heat. We all remember the heat wave in India last summer where temperatures were over 50 degrees for 2 weeks. So that's uninhabitable, right? It's certainly uninhabitable if you're a farmer and trying to make a living. So we're in the line of fire in our markets. We also bank the markets that are the biggest carbon emitters. Yes. Obviously the US is the big one, but where we have a very big business, but India, China, et cetera. Those are the markets where, if we get the financing in place, there's a tremendous will to decarbonize their economy. Right? India is generating more renewable power capacity every year than almost any place on Earth, probably second only to China. Yeah. But it's not enough.
No, and the big question, of course, is how do you convince skeptical investors that adaptation is as important as mitigation?
That's a tough one, and the problem with adaptation projects, so helping countries accommodate for the fact that sea temperatures are rising, water levels are rising, land temperatures those are typically not economic projects.
No, that's right.
What we need to do is to make the case that there is an economic benefit to investment today to avoid really quite horrific consequences down the road.
Yeah, you need to do that quickly, though. And is that message getting through?
We put out some really good research on adaptation to say a dollar spent today saves $9 10 years from now, not 30 years from now. Yeah. I think people, this notion of 2050, 2030, feels like it's very abstract. Now, the adaptation money is today, you're going to save that in 6 years.
Yeah. Final question, do the emerging markets here, do you think they will have reason to leave this COP in a better mood than when they arrived?
Well, obviously, there's been some good progress on the loss and damages and things like that. That's part of what they've been looking for a long time in terms of, please recognize that we haven't created this problem, but we're going to suffer from it. I think the amount of financial commitment that's coming from a few discrete sources like the UAE, with the idea that could be replicated elsewhere, with, I think, a refocus on nature, which I'm afraid we lost the way a little bit with especially the carbon market related to nature, having lost some credibility because of, unfortunately, a handful of projects that probably weren't well structured, but gave the whole thing a bad name. So I think in all those cases, there's hope that we can sort of pull ourselves back up.
Okay, Phil, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Brazil and Democratic Republic of Congo are the world's two largest rainforest nations. 2 years ago, 145 countries pledged to end deforestation by 2030. On Saturday, Brazil's President Lula didn't mince his words when he said the planet is tired of climate agreements that are not being fulfilled, that financing for poor nations never comes. I put that to his Minister for Indigenous Peoples. Minister, thank you very much for speaking with Reuters. Look, your president said on yesterday, that all these climate agreements and goals are never fulfilled. The financing for poorer countries never comes. We need concrete action. What is the sense you're getting from this COP now about concrete action?
Está cada vez mais comprovado que os povos indígenas são.
It's already proven that indigenous peoples are the best guardians of the forest. So it's very important telling this COP that commitments are made so that climate finance and conservation finance go directly to the indigenous peoples who are the best stewards of it.
And what sort of policy changes and policy action from subnational governments, from governments, are you hoping to see on the back of a meeting like this?
So again, there have to be direct investments for both. The federal government as well as different states, so that they can actually implement the policies in order to provide health assistance, cultural support, as well as environmental support. All the things that are needed so that governments can implement their policies.
Is there too much focus on mitigation once again here at COP and not enough on adaptation?
There's still a lot to be learned in terms of both strategies in order to mitigate, as well as to provide adaptation strategies. So the indigenous peoples are important in order to participate in the adaptation strategies. Finance is needed directly in order for them to be able to do that.
Last question and a broad question. How supported do you feel as the voice of the indigenous person here? How supported do you feel at this COP28, or do you leave once again feeling disappointed?
It's too early to say. The COP is just starting. But we have hope that commitments will be made between now and COP30. So that we can avoid the point of no return.
Minister Guajajara of Brazil there. I also caught up with the DRC's Environment Minister. Again, a fair bit of skepticism, a familiar refrain here, as to pledges to help some of the world's poorer nations. Minister, thank you for talking with Reuters. I've spoken to a number of heads of state from African nations, and I think the message I've received is one of skepticism, yet again, about commitments for developing nations. What is your sense? Are you optimistic?
Yes, I'm optimistic about the progress made. The best thing has been the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. But our wish is, first of all, that this fund can't overshadow the commitment taken by those responsible for pollution in terms of $100 billion per year. It's now been 14 years since this commitment was fulfilled. Secondly, we hope that the fund isn't difficult to access. We absolutely need accessibility. That also means openness of the fund and knowing how it is managed. I also think it'd be better if there were representatives of countries who will use the fund present in the fund's management. That way, the fund will be clearer.
We had an announcement on day one, loss and damage, up to, I think it's up to 700-800 million now, but very little from the United States in that. Is that something we should be talking about? Are you disappointed with the US commitment?
In terms of the US have a great responsibility because they're one of the developed countries who have 80% of responsibility for pollution. So the money we are asking for, the funds that we are asking for, shouldn't be considered like a loan or a gift. But it's more of a commitment, a contribution in the fight against pollution and against climate change. So if you want our message to them, it's help us to help you, because we're not the ones responsible.
Last question. You are one of two largest rainforest nations in the world. What is your message now to the rest of the world directly from the people of the rainforest?
Directly, what we say to you is that we protect the forests. It's not because someone is telling us to protect the forests, but because it's our duty. And secondly, I want the whole world to know that the only solution based on nature in fighting against climate change is forests, peatlands, mangroves, but also minerals, critical strategic sources of which we are full, which will help us in the energy transition. And we have the duty to transform these minerals locally in order to facilitate our access to this new technology. And then we too can contribute to reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius in temperature. If that's not done, if the funds necessary to support the forests are not there, then I tell you it'll be massacre. We're not asking for gifts. We are asking for two things for the protection of the forests. Firstly, the upward revision of the price of a ton of carbon, so we can use funds to finance our own adaptation and mitigation projects. Secondly, access to the sovereign markets, which are currently blocked to us by polluting states.
Plenty of climate activists here at COP28. One of them is Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa, very nice of you to come and talk to Reuters. Thank you very much. Now look, you've said finance has to serve people, among many other things. That means clean energy, not fossil fuels. The president of this event is very closely linked, of course, as you know, to a fossil fuel company. What do you make of the pledges and the promises on the financing side that we've had already? Are you happy with that?
Thank you so much. So I know that some pledges have been made in regards to the loss and damage fund, but many of these pledges have been coming in millions. However, the costs of loss and damage are in billions. The people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, they need billions to address the worst impacts of this crisis, and not millions. And when I say that finance has to serve the interests of the people, it is because climate change is more than weather. It's more than statistics. It's really about the people. And that is why we must have a human face in the conversation about the climate crisis. But then there is also worries about the fossil fuel influence over the COP process. And I think for me, that is my biggest worry.
You know, obviously adaptation is such an important part of this conversation, and we talk a lot about mitigation, as you know. I've seen a lot of sessions here focused on adaptation, I think probably more than we saw last year and the year before. I did a big panel with the indigenous peoples this morning. Do you think they're slowly getting the balance right and the focus right?
Well, adaptation is important. Loss and damage is important as well. But if I saw that you were in a burning house the first thing I would do would be to try to get you out of that burning house and not to build you another house, because maybe by the time I build you that other house, you've lost your life in the house that is on fire. And that is what I'm seeing here, that we are not addressing the root cause of the climate crisis. Fossil fuels account for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we are not addressing the elephant in the room. Simply put, they are the problem. The latest IPCC report said that we must halve emissions by 2030 to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. How will that be possible if we are ignoring the elephant in the room?
What are some of the most, who are you talking to here? What are some of the most interesting, promising conversations that you've had? And are people listening to you?
The only interesting conversations have been on the Loss and Damage Fund operationalization. However, there is a worry that this could have been a distraction for the real agenda that is in this place, an agenda that is not addressing the root cause of the climate crisis. Like I said, if we don't address fossil fuels, everything else is a distraction. Loss and damage will become even worse in frontline communities. Adaptation in itself will become impossible. So adaptation is important, loss and damage is important, the pledges are important, but we must talk about the real problem here, and that is fossil fuels.
Who do you really want to talk to here? I mean, would it be more important to you to talk to the leaders of the fossil fuel companies, or is it more important to you to talk to those trying to mitigate the issue and solve the problems, whether it's through technology, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, my message is mostly to the fossil fuel industries, but also to the governments that give them these new licenses. The IEA has made it very clear that if we want to have a fighting chance of 1.5 degrees, we cannot have any new fossil fuel investments. So my message goes to the fossil fuel industry, which I know is heavily represented in this place. The earlier we understand the sabotage of the fossil fuel industry in this place, the earlier we will mobilize and organize ourselves as citizens of the planet to say enough is enough. We need an equitable, fair, fast, and just, phase out of fossil fuels and a phase in of renewables.
Final question. We're doing a show as well here on technologies. I think I heard you call CCS and other direct air capture technologies fairy tale solutions.
Exactly.
You don't have any belief in those solutions?
I don't believe in CCS, not because I'm an expert, but because experts have said, like the IEA has said, it's expensive and it's risky, but we also know that it hasn't reached the commercial scale to address the climate crisis. It doesn't address the air pollution that kills more than 5 million people annually as a result of the burning of fossil fuels. So to me, CCS is a false solution, it's a fairy tale, and it allows fossil fuel companies to continue business as usual.
All right, Vanessa, thank you very much for talking with us.
You're welcome.
Working out if the climate financing agreed here is sufficient for the most vulnerable isn't just about impact now, but in the future. I spoke to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on what climate justice means for international migration flows. Refugee flows and climate finance, especially for poor nations, are increasingly mentioned in the same sentence. What do you make of the pledges that we've seen so far from this COP? The loss and damage, the General Climate Fund, the development banks upping their game. What do you think?
I think there's a macro issue and then a more specific refugee displacement issue. The macro issue, I'm not an expert, but I think we all agree, good that finally we talk resources. They talk resources, but they're still very inadequate to the magnitude of the challenge, which brings me to the smaller issue, or the not so small, but the sub-issue, which is climate pushes people away from their homes, sometimes in combination with conflict, sometimes not. And therefore, there are people that are displaced by climate. We need resources to help them, to address the root causes, to create adaptation, to mitigate certain factors, and that if that big picture is not enough, the small picture will not progress.
Give me a sense of just how much more money we need on the climate piece to have any impact on the migration bit.
I'll give you one example. My organization, the biggest refugee organization in the world, has a budget of about $10–11 billion, depending on the year. We calculate that about 10%, $1 billion, is needed just to address the climate element of this displacement. So, but that is one organization. So you have to multiply it for the rest of the system. So it's quite big.
You mentioned both mitigation and adaptation just now, and it's something I've spoken to a lot of people about this week. Is there enough focus on the adaptation piece? I know that they're upping their game here as well, and we're talking a little bit more about adaptation, but it's still a massive problem. It's still left behind, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. And, in my world, adaptation is a lot because we deal with people that are impacted directly in their daily lives, in their shelter, in their food, in their drinking water by climate change. So if we don't help them adapt, the suffering will multiply. And this is increasing. One interesting thing is that it's not just climate pushing people because of drought, because of floods, because of conflict generated by this, but it's also that when people are in displacement, more often than not, they are in areas extremely fragile from the climate point of view. I was in Chad just a few weeks ago. It's amazing. They go to areas where there's nothing, there's no resources, where you need to invest in sustainable energy. That's the adaptation for displaced people.
Is there enough cross-pollination at the UN agencies, between the big NGOs and policy, between policy and business? Because let's face it, the adaptation piece, a lot of it comes down to convincing investors that they need to start putting their money in the right places. Is there enough cross-pollination, would you say?
Not yet. I was at a very interesting event here in Dubai last night, precisely on these aspects, working on climate in fragile situations. And we all practitioners concluded that we need to strengthen the links between climate action, humanitarian work, and development, long-term work. This is indispensable. But I think the fact that finally we speak about these things at COP creates a space where we can discuss these matters.
So you leave tomorrow feeling optimistic? No, that's probably too strong a word, is it?
But let's also be serious about this matter. The optimism is about what do we do about the 1.5 degrees. Yeah. The optimism is what do we do about mitigation and adaptation, macro talk about that, macro decisions about that, about taking away subsidies to fossil fuels and putting money into clean energy. This is what makes or breaks the COP. The rest comes under that umbrella.
Yeah. All right. Filippo Grande, thank you very much. That is it for our second show here on the ground at COP28 in Dubai. Stay across Reuters.com for show 3, which will focus on the technologies battling climate change. Lots of heated debate in this space. I'm Axel Threlfall in Dubai.